When it comes to understanding exposure, and in relation to that maybe apertures and shutter speeds, we could argue, I suppose, that the digital age has helped quite a bit, because for the first time ever we do see the results of what we've just taken on the back of our camera. But during the course of these videos you may hear me refer to 125th at 5.6, 250th of a second at f8, but in the digital age our cameras now can actually capture mid-ranges of both apertures and shutter speeds, so we could quite conceivably see 180th of a second at f6.7. And I wonder sometimes if that actually adds to the learning process. Because when we're learning apertures and shutter speeds, it's very good, I think, to stay within whole numbers, which means when I refer to one stop or two stops, what am I talking about? Well, let's look at a typical lens. Here we're looking down the business end of my 28 to 135 lens, and with the aid of some computer graphics I've produced a broad range of apertures for us to view, beginning with f2.8, which is the widest aperture this lens can give. Now if we move one stop, and we've moved from 2.8 to f4, you can see the hole in the lens now is marginally smaller, and what I've effectively done here is I've halved the exposure. From 2.8 to f4 I've halved the exposure, so we have to think of all of these as whole numbers or stops. So as we change the controls on our camera and we stop the lens down, we see that as the number becomes bigger, the aperture becomes smaller, which again is a little bit of a contradicting thing. But if we go next to f8, again f8 is half the exposure of 5.6, f11 is half again from f8, and so on. Now some lenses will go down quite small, well beyond 22 to 32, and some will open up a little wider. But what we've just viewed there is a pretty reasonably average range of apertures in our lenses. Now when it comes to shutter speeds, we see much the same. As I've just explained, we normally think of whole stops when we're talking about shutter speeds and apertures, but with modern cameras we don't always see that. But it may help the learning process if we can think of that while we're trying to pick up the basics. So let's start at the top end here. Let's say the fastest shutter speed the camera can deliver is 1/1000th of a second. Many can do much more than that, of course. The next one down is 1/500th of a second. Now 1/500th of a second is slower, so what it means is the curtain or the shutter is open much longer, so there's more light getting in, and in fact it's the equivalent of the aperture stops. What I've just done there is I've doubled the amount of exposure that I'm about to capture. So each time I go down, now to 250th of a second, I'm doubling the exposure each of the times. So let's go down the scale just a little more. After 250th of a second, if I wanted to double the exposure, then I need to go to 125th of a second. If I want to double the exposure again, I go to 60th, then 30th, then 15th, then you'll notice that it goes to usually 1/10th or 1/8th, then 1/4 of a second, half a second, and then 1 second. And of course some cameras can go even slower than this. Now when I talk about changing the aperture or shutter and halving or doubling the exposure, we mustn't worry too much about the halving or doubling the exposure. It's not something we need to dwell on very much. But of course there is a logic to the settings we use on our camera. I was talking earlier on about going outside my street door and firing off a shot in sunny conditions at 100 ISO, and I got a near perfect exposure Shouldn't say the word perfect with exposure, should I? I got a pretty good exposure with 250th of a second at f8. But I could have chosen something else, couldn't I? Had I used 125th of a second at f11, it would be exactly the same exposure. Think about what I've done. I've slowed down the shutter speed, so from 250th of a second to 125th, I'm saying give me twice the light to expose the shot. But then, using the aperture, I've gone from f8 to 11, and I've told the lens to give me half the light. So it's exactly the same exposure as 250th of a second at f8. And we can take this further, and here, as you can see, I've gone down to a 60th of a second shutter, so a much slower shutter speed, but a much smaller aperture, so the exposure I'm giving here is exactly the same as 250 at f8. Why would I want to choose f16 at a 60th of a second as opposed to 250th of a second at f8? Well, perhaps I was photographing a flower, and I'm getting quite close to the flower, and now the depth of field, the area in the image that I want sharp, needs to be greater, so I'm putting the emphasis of my exposure into the aperture rather than the shutter.